This episode is dedicated to Jennifer Collis. Jen was a friend and co-worker to many of us here at Security Weekly. I worked with Jen for quite some time, and she continues to be an inspiration for me to this day. Jen lost her husband to cancer just before starting to work at Tenable, where she had to work with me, which sometimes is no small task. Then disaster struck, and Jen was diagnosed with cancer. The last time we spoke, she had words of encouragement for me for my new endeavors, despite her own situation. That's just the kind of person Jen was. Jen leaves behind 2 children and has a fund set up for donations. You can get all of the information at securityweekly.com/FSCK cancer. This is a Security Weekly production. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Security Weekly is brought to you by the SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security training, certification, and research. Visit SANS.org to explore the full curriculum and latest training offerings. Onapsis, the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle business-critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com. Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, the Pwn Phone, and the Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com.
And welcome to the show. I'm not alone this time. I'm here with a man, I think. We're going to go with a man, Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Last time I checked, I am, in fact, a man. Even though Jeff Mann is not here, because he is also a man. As well.
And when you refer to him as Mr., he's Mr.
Man.
Mr. Man. He is the man.
Larry Pesci is, of course, here in studio.
Yes, drooping drink on my lap.
Showed me some really cool Bluetooth low-energy stuff before the show. That was pretty awesome. We're going to have to do a tech segment on that.
Yes. Oh, believe me, this has been my focus of the week, doing
low
energy assessment for some stuff this week. So
I've been pretty low energy this week, too.
Jack Daniel is here in the studio. Welcome, Jack.
Now the question is, have you been Bluetooth low energy or Bluetooth smart?
That's right.
Just low energy.
On the lines via Skype, we've got Michael Santarcangelo. Michael, welcome to the show.
Always good to be with you guys.
Mr. Joff Thayer is here. Welcome, Joff.
Hello, how is everybody? Welcome to a lovely Thursday evening again.
That's right. Carlos Perez is also here with us. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Paul. Happy to be here.
Yes. I just want to, this episode, we don't normally dedicate, I don't know, this may be the first time we've ever dedicated
I think so.
An episode. As you heard in the beginning, Jen was a coworker of mine. And it's interesting for people listening to the show that may have seen some of the Nessus marketing or videos that we produced during a certain time frame of a couple of years. It was a couple of years ago and about for a year and a half, almost 2 years. Jen was kind of like the behind-the-scenes person behind that. And I talked with Jen almost every day during that time frame. So
Yep.
you may not be a name that you've heard, but certainly
she was
seen the
behind
result.
a lot of the content that you and I did. You did more of it, but a lot of it. And Jen was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she worked with Jack, Carlos, and Jeff. Actually, couldn't be here at the services this evening for Jen. So, as I said in the introduction, if you go to securityweekly.com/FSCK cancer, and of course, cancer affects not just myself and Jen, a lot of us at Tenable, but a lot of us personally here on the show. So
both personal and in the community.
yeah, so you may see that page morph. I kind of set it up this week for Jen, so you can make donations to support her family fund, but also moving forward in the future. A lot of us that are here in the show or connected to the show obviously have causes that we'd like you to support, and so you can do that at that URL. SecurityWeekly.com/FSCK Cancer is the dedication for this show. So I feel it's a small thing I could do in the grand scheme of things, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, are any other announcements, comments, questions about that whole thing?
I've got SANS courses going. You can probably figure out how to find that at SANS.org. Primarily the wireless course, Vegas coming up. Pentest Hackfest later in the year as well. And it won't be out in time, I don't think, but I will be in London in 2 weeks. That will be an awesome class.
You will be in London?
I will.
Awesome.
I will.
Jack, you were just in London.
I was spent 2 weeks in the UK, a full 8 days in London. It was great. Let's see if it's still part of the EU tomorrow.
Oh, is that happening again?
Well, today is the Brexit vote, or was today. So
that happens every couple of years or so, right?
Well, this is a big one, and it's as a cynical American tourist, if they leave, then their pound collapses and our money's worth something over there, which it wasn't last week.
So it's a really good thing that I haven't got my pounds yet.
Yeah, well, but who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
That's for them to decide. But since
Will they have chip and pin though, Jack? Because I know you want to
You
be
always, Michael
Jeff's not
always
here.
has to.
Jeff's not here.
they have chip and pin and tap to pay, and it actually works and stuff. And sometime we'll discuss why it is that Walmart and others are suing the credit card brands for skipping chip and pin and sticking with chip and signature.
But that'll be a fun discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, we're all too sober for that. And
As long
besides,
as we
have
agree it has nothing to do with security, it'll be a lot of fun.
For a segue, my understanding is a former UK resident for a while, at least from me following him on Boing Boing.
Yeah, we got somebody we want to talk to, don't we?
Yeah.
Special interview for this evening is none other than Cory Doctorow of craphound.com, a science fiction author, activist, journalist, and blogger. He currently works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation and co-founded the UK Open Rights Group. He was born in Toronto, Canada, but now lives here in the lovely US of A. Cory, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. I came here to take your American blogging jobs.
Yes. Well, you do a fantastic job, so we're more than happy to give you the blogging jobs. Cory, I want to dive right into it because I was watching a recent presentation that you gave. I think it was the most recent one that you had on your blog, and you stirred up a whole bunch of questions. And the first one that came to mind was, I began thinking about this, and it's interesting the background because I have business in media in cigars, which is very heavily regulated. And I got to thinking about how Twitter, Facebook, and Google being the primary conduits for sharing information, and how are you concerned about these big tech giants controlling that information?
Yeah, I am. I've come to realize that I oftentimes don't have the solution to that sort of problem, but I know what makes it harder to fix. So, I don't know exactly, I have a media business too. I'm one of the owners of this website, Boing Boing, and I don't know what we do about the way Facebook relates to us or the way that other big media companies relate to us. But I do know that you can make it much harder for whatever solution emerges by doing things like making it harder to found alternatives to Facebook or alternatives to Twitter or any of these other big platforms that might come along and compete for access to the material we produce. And I think that's a really good kind of precautionary principle when you're thinking about regulation, is rather than trying to solve the problem, just making sure that if a solution does come along, it doesn't end up screwing everyone over, that there's a way that it can actually emerge.
The scary part for me, and in fact it just happened today, with the Security Weekly, we lost the ability to take out Facebook ads with no explanation. We violated the guidelines, and that was it. Is there, do you see this happening more and more? And it to me, it's kind of scary as to how much we've become to rely on these social media platforms to aid our own media creation in spreading the word.
Well, I think that there's an analogy to security, right? Like it's hard to make things work. Things on average break, and so defenders are usually in a harder position than attackers. And if you're defending against, kind of monopolistic practices, you have to not have any weaknesses that the monopolist can attack, and the monopolist only has to find one weakness that they can use to leverage against you. But as with security, we have these core principles, right? There shouldn't be any barriers to disclosure of true facts about vulnerabilities, because if there are, then companies might ensure that vulnerabilities are longer lived, which will allow for more exploitation of them. We have ideas like we should, wherever possible, be able to scrutinize source code, not because it saved us with Heartbleed, but because no one's ever argued that Heartbleed would have been easier to find if only that source code had been closed. So again, I don't know how we solve this. I mean, it seems like there are going to be some serious problems because the web does return great benefits to scale and seems to afford enormous power to the internet giants, that it's easier for them to get bigger once they're big. But at the same time, I think that if we do things like allow phone companies to decide which websites we can and can't access at the maximum possible speed, all we'll do is ensure that, in the long run, Facebook and the phone company, Google and the phone company will become indistinguishable. And so I'm interested in kind of shoring up the defender side rather than trying to predict what the attacker side, what attack we can use as a counteroffensive.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we talk about government regulation sometimes here on the show. Certainly in the cigar industry, huge government regulatory issues going on there. But how do we? Some may say, well, to solve some of these problems, maybe the government needs to come up with regulations. But that's certainly a double-edged sword, right?
Well, I think that in a lot of cases, when we argue against regulation, what we're really doing is saying, all of this regulation over here, we're going to pretend it isn't regulation. And then we're going to say anything that reforms it is regulation. So look at telecoms, right? No phone company would exist if it wasn't for regulation. Imagine being AT&T and trying to buy the right to enter every basement in Manhattan, right? $1 trillion later, you still wouldn't have coverage. So it starts with this regulation that says if you're the phone company, you get to go into people's basements and put poles on public streets and do all kinds of other things that, if you and I wanted to go out there and do them,
right, we
wouldn't be allowed to do them. And if you wanted to pay for them at market rates, it would be 5x the GDP of the country, right? So you start with this huge regulatory gift with a kind of bow around it. And then we just pretend that wasn't a regulatory gift. And the phone companies go if we're not given the power to control what bits flow over our networks and to extort, rents from companies to access our customers, which are really not the phone company's customers, they're YouTube's customers or Boing Boing's customers or Security Weekly's customers. If we can't extort rent for accessing our customers, then we're being regulated out of existence. And I think the correct response from a telecoms regulator, the New York Attorney General just did some good work on this, should be to say, if you want to run your libertopian network that is totally unregulated, go and raise venture capital for it and clear the right to dig up all the sidewalks in New York and San Francisco and everywhere else, 1 foot at a time. In the meantime, you've got 60 days to get your copper out of our dirt, or we'll just buy it from you for scrappage price and allow that network to be operated by a company that is willing to operate in the public interest, having gotten this incalculably valuable public gift. And I think that once you start thinking about regulation that way as the whole package and not just the part that's new regulation and pretending all the regulation that happened before doesn't really count or just sort of grandfathering it in, then you start to get into really good evidence-based policy.
Cory, that was an awesome story. I had no idea that conversation had happened. And
yeah, where do we stand? Where do we stand today with those regulations? You mentioned the big telcos and regulating the internet and determining how content is accessed and who gets content. Where do we stand with that today?
So the FCC passed this open internet rule, a Title II rule, that proclaimed that landline carriers and to a lesser extent mobile carriers couldn't charge for premium carriage on their networks. So all packets should be treated equally for whatever that means. Obviously, there's like a network management layer at which it's hard to define exactly what you mean by all packets created equally. But we certainly know when packets aren't being created equally when we see it, like when you see, packets from Netflix being slowed down and packets from Netflix big competitor not being slowed down. So they're not allowed to do that anymore. And one of the ways that they've responded is by attacking a loophole. Most of the mobile carriers and an increasing number of the landline carriers are imposing caps on bandwidth use. Those caps are becoming more aggressive, even as the amount of rich media that people want to access is becoming is driving bandwidth consumption. And what they do is they go to the same companies they used to attack for bribes for premium carriage, and now they ask them for bribes for being exempted from the data cap. Mm-hmm. And that's not an entirely new practice. It was something that was done for a long time in India, where there was really severe data caps on the monopoly ISPs, and they would do things like strike deals with games companies to exempt certain MMOs from those caps. And so they would go and source these like Z-list MMOs that no one else in the world played, and they would exempt them from the caps. And then, games like Warcraft would be inside the cap, and Warcraft wouldn't catch on, and these Z-list games would, because they would pay bribes. What was interesting was that Facebook tried to strike a deal with one of the bigger carriers in India to exempt Facebook and a few services that they would pick from a cap. And it aroused a lot of ire from Indians who basically said, we don't want a poor internet for poor people. We want poor people who are at a disadvantage relative to everybody else to at least be able to access the same internet as rich people. And so they fought this effort from Facebook to have this two-tiered internet where Facebook and its hand-picked services would be free and everything else would be really expensive. And the Indian's telecom regulator said, okay, well, we're going to do a consultation on this. And they wrote actually a really good consultation paper that asked like 8 questions about what's called zero rating. And they invited responses from the public. And Facebook and its adversaries started to get people to answer the consultation. Facebook took out like full-page newspaper ads, and Mark Zuckerberg wrote full-page op-eds in the big Indian newspapers, and there were signs on all the billboards. And the pro-Indian net neutrality activists also worked their networks and, I think worked them through Facebook and stuff. Yeah. And what was hilarious was that Facebook encouraged people to write to the regulator and say, we like Facebook, and we think Facebook should be free on our mobile data service plans. And that was not one of the questions that had been asked by the regulator. Whereas the net neutrality advocates asked its supporters to send answers into these 8 consultative questions. And so Facebook sent like millions of messages to the regulator. There was at one point this thing where when you scrolled past the internal Facebook ad that said, please support Facebook, if you scrolled past it, everyone in your network would get a post saying like, Cory supports Facebook and you should too. And they sent millions and millions of responses into the regulator, none of which answered any of the consultative questions. And so the regulator said, well, these aren't responsive to our consultation, and they just ignored them. And they took the responses from the net neutrality advocates, which actually answer the questions that had been asked, and they decided that they would have network neutrality in India, which is pretty cool. It's actually further ahead of what we've got here.
When you were giving your talk, Cory, you mentioned that how we make compromises when it comes to our privacy and security. What are some examples of some of the major compromises that you believe we've made over time that have had the most serious repercussions?
Well, I think that in the realm of security and content distribution, a really easy to see compromise would be DRM. So people in the security world don't really believe that DRM is real, right? They think of it as kind of at best a harmless delusion. Like there's some way that you can give your adversary a player that has a key in it, and then hope that the adversary never finds the key. And anyone who wants to can become your adversary just by subscribing to your service. And like most security experts look at that and go like, that's just wishful thinking. But DRM comes with this governmental rule. In the U.S., it's DMCA Section 1201. Other countries have their own versions of it. And that rule says that if you break a DRM or if you disclose information that that details a defect in DRM, so that its attackers will know where to start attacking, that you have committed a felony. And you can go to jail for 5 years for a first offense, and you could pay a $500,000 fine. And I think a lot of geeks looked at this and they were like, it's just Netflix. Why do we care? It's just, YouTube Premium Video. It's just some other product, Hulu.
It's just DCSS.
It's just DCSS. And you know how to break it, right? Like I know how to get around it, and all the people I know how to get around it. It doesn't really matter. It's not that big a deal. And what's ended up happening is that on the one hand, we've promulgated this idea that like you can make DRM work. So there are a lot of lawmakers and policymakers and even technical experts who are like, well, DRM kind of works. The executive of the World Wide Web Consortium, who I think we'll be talking about later, they really think, or at least publicly profess to believe, that there are DRMs that survive contact with the real world. And that's like abundantly not true. But by security experts pretending that it is, we've gotten to this position where people's response when they hear about DRM breaking is, there must have been a mistake in the DRM, not we're trying to make water that's not wet. Not we're trying to do the impossible. And so we've legitimized this idea, which means that whenever industry goes and complains that their DRM is being broken, governments and regulators who rely on experts like you and me to kind of establish the national conversation about what is and isn't a legitimate technological goal, they go, oh, well, if the DRM is being broken, we must need some kind of legislative solution, right? Like if the anti-gravity device isn't working yet, we probably aren't just giving enough money to the Ministry of Anti-Gravity, because all of the nerds kind of, whenever we mention anti-gravity, go like, yeah, go ahead and make your anti-gravity. I'm sure it'll work someday, as opposed to saying, your anti-gravity machine is never ever going to work, and it's dumb for you to even try. We're not disputing that anti-gravity would be useful. We're just disputing whether or not it's possible.
And that's because, Cory, there's laws on the books today that says that if I find a flaw in DRM, it's punishable by a federal crime? Or it's a federal crime?
Yeah, there's civil and criminal penalties for it. And whenever we say, okay, well, like as people who are like in the industry, whenever we say, okay, put DRM in the Keurig coffee maker, or okay, put DRM in GM cars, or okay, put DRM in pacemakers, is probably harmless. What we do is we legitimize this idea that just isn't true, right? Or we say, okay, put DRM on mobile platforms like iOS to stop me from installing third-party apps.
Yeah. And wireless routers too. They've tried that as well.
Yeah. So like that's a really good example. So the FCC had this like totally legitimate concern, which is that when you have software-defined radios in home routers, then loading bad code onto them, or malicious code, or code that just gets into like a race condition, could conceivably turn that device into an unintentional emitter into bands that are used for pretty important stuff. Like you could end up interfering with emergency communications or air traffic signaling or other stuff.
I wrote a book about some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a legitimate thing to worry about, right? And so they were like, okay, so how are we going to solve this? And their answer was, oh, I know. We'll just have general purpose computers that are incapable of running programs that do bad things with software-defined radios. Job done. It's what Bruce Schneier calls the security syllogism. Something must be done.
Yes.
There, I've done something.
Yeah. Like, let's just ban it. Like that behavior's bad, so that behavior is now banned. We're done.
Yeah.
We're secure now.
And it's like the worst of all possible worlds, because on the one hand, like, I might need a ride in an ambulance someday, and I don't want someone's Wi-Fi router screwing with emergency dispatch when that day comes. And on the other hand, I also don't want us to have rules that pretend that you can make a computer that's Turing complete except for programs you don't like. And so like, we have this non-solution that actually leaves us in this unsafe condition, and also promulgates this nonsensical idea that guarantees that we'll have more of it, and then backstopping it all is this law that says like investigating how a general purpose computer works for the purpose of identifying defects and flaws in it is a potential legal minefield, which again, like, you want your home router to be subjected to aggressive adversarial security research, because as we see, like, every time there's giant DDoS attacks being launched from home routers, that there are a lot of these devices. They tend to be never updated. They tend to be on fairly fat pipes, and they sit at the border of an internal network through which a lot of sensitive information travels, including increasingly like signals between very badly designed Internet of Things devices that can like burn your house down or give access to your drop cam to like randos on the internet, and then also face the public internet and can be used just to make mischief on that. So we really want those devices to be aggressively investigated, and for any problems with them to be surfaced quickly and remediated. And instead, we now have devices that still can be used to screw up air traffic control, and also security researchers can't tell you when there's something wrong with it that might allow your nanny cam to like broadcast you at 2 a.m. naked in your kid's room trying to get them to go back to sleep.
Well, it is a huge problem too, Cory, because while we want the security researchers to be able to do the work, and I think the FCC recently like clarified those rules and said, well, you can put custom third-party firmware, but again, we still don't want you to use it as, an emitter to disrupt traffic.
Right. Well, so like I'm in favor of the rule that says don't use your router to screw up important radio applications. I think that's a good rule. The question of like whether it's an enforceable rule or whether it will work is a significant one, because obviously we want a solution that works. But the fact that we know that the alternative, which is like locking down routers so that they only accept signed firmware blobs that have been certified by the FCC not to do bad things, we know that doesn't work. The fact that we know a bunch of things that don't work and don't necessarily know what does work doesn't mean that we should just take one of the things that doesn't work and pretend that it does.
Yeah, well, in wireless is tricky too, because as much as we want to make our own routers resilient, as much as we want to make emergency services resilient, the problem with the wireless is it's in the air, right? I may or may not know of, wireless researchers that take cars and able to emit signal on a particular channel in the 802.11 spectrum and cause massive denial of service. So that stuff happens, but making it resilient is tough, especially with wireless, because it's kind of just in the air.
So when this first was mooted, it was actually like more than a decade ago that the FCC first mooted this possibility of software-defined radios interfering with licensed users of the electromagnetic spectrum, and they put out a notice of inquiry saying, like, should we mandate that all devices capable of being a software-defined radio must have locked firmware that only accepts code signed by the FCC. No. And like, this is just clearly like a dumb idea, because all devices capable of being a software-defined radio is every general-purpose computer. And so, like, that seems like a pretty big mandate, that before you could run any code ever on anything that was Turing complete, the FCC would have to audit it and sign it. That seems like not a great answer.
Not a great idea.
And so I went around to... Yeah. So I went around to a whole ton of people and said, like, I'm going to file comments with the FCC saying, don't do this. What do you think I should tell them to do? And the best answer I got came from two people independently. They both proposed the same answer. One is Lamar Freed, who founded Adafruit, and the other one is Bunny Huang, who was then at MIT, the guy who wrote the Xbox. Yeah, and they both said, well, look, in an era of ubiquitous software-defined radios, you are going to be carrying devices that for your own purposes are going to want to know why they're struggling to receive signal. Not because you're necessarily worried about, like, DDoS attacks, but even if, like, nobody in the world ever DDoSed anything, someone would like drop their vacuum cleaner and dislodge its shielding. Or you would have a software-defined radio device that just was not very well made, and the software would get into a race condition and just start doing things that were not anticipated. Halting state is real, right? And so you would want that device to continuously be cooperating with other devices that you owned to triangulate on and log the locations of potential trouble spots, and to form quorums of attention-seeking notifiers, location-based notifiers, saying somewhere over there is a thing that's making me less effective. And if you imagine that would be a thing that we would all want, that in fact we'd all need once we dispense with all the wires, then it's not a huge leap to go from there to saying, okay, well, somewhere in the world we will post public lists of these things, and where you start to see convergence of signed attestations about sites of persistent radio noise or interference, then that gives you a kind of enforcement blueprint. So, like, the FCC, mostly the way that it deals with harmful interference, it has this pre-flight check where before you ship a device into the world, you take it to the FCC and you subject it to its test suite.
Sure.
And then afterwards, you have post hoc interference enforcement, where people call up and they go like, my TV doesn't work, and I can't receive my radio signals, and our planes keep falling out of the sky. And then the FCC shows up, and, we all saw Pump Up the Volume. They drive around in those vans, and they have those antennas on the back, and they find the bad emitters, right? Well, like, we don't know how to solve the problem of making sure that no device ever does anything bad, but we actually do have, like, in lockstep with the growth of devices capable of doing bad things, is the growth of devices capable of detecting, triangulating on, logging, and attesting to bad things.
Yep, and I just saw that and I didn't get to read the article, but I basically saw the headlines that basically the FCC is looking to do some significantly different and more measurements to find out why the radio noise floor has increased over a number of years. Go figure.
Sure. I mean, I don't know why, but, I would assume that it's some combination of just like more wireless devices, but also a lot more electrical devices that have high frequency components that are indifferently shielded. Presumably that does that creates a kind of background that we have to work harder.
It's an interesting segue, as most of the devices we're talking about are made in China for the most part. And when we talk about backdoors, do backdoors end up in software and hardware today, Cory, because people don't realize the repercussions, or because some people are just truly evil? Like, what's the reasoning behind it?
So we're kind of getting back to this idea of like compromises, right? So every business that's ever done something terrible, most of them anyway, has had people who had moral qualms about the terrible thing that they did. And that moral qualm usually related to a long-term consequence. Like, there was a video this week that I just put on Boing Boing. Actually, I think it was yesterday. I don't know when this show will go out. Of these 3 guys in Nevada who for 2 weeks their boss had been telling them to go and dump this toxic waste, barrels of toxic waste, in the desert. And they'd been going out for 2 weeks, and all the plants where they were dumping had died. And then they would torch the remainder of the barrel, the residue, and they'd flatten the barrels and get them out of there. And they were sitting there saying, I've got 4 kids. I can't afford to lose my job. If I refuse my boss, I'll get fired, and the next guy will go ahead and do it. There's nothing I can do about it now. And so what they're doing is they're like taking this long-term cost, which is that the world their kids are going to grow up in is going to be toxic, and also they may end up going to jail. And they're hyperbolically discounting it. It's an economist term for like making a huge discount that's not justified by any kind of a rational valuation. So they hyperbolically discount the future cost, and then they focus on the short-term gain, which is like not losing their jobs and not losing their houses. And that's a thing that, when a company does something like, when the NSA shows up and says, you need to allow us to put a back door in, and the company says no, and they say, well, we're going to make things incredibly hard for you, and then you won't be able to operate, and all the people who rely on you to pay their mortgages are going to be out on the street. Sometimes the company says yes. And, when you look at something like a warrant canary, which is this idea that you have these regularly published and ideally machine-readable reports that say how many secret warrants you've received, and you start publishing them when the number is 0. And then when the number becomes non-zero, you just stop publishing them, or you omit that line from your transparency report, from your warrant canary. Is that it changes the short-term benefit picture, because if you have a product whose pitch is that it's secure, and it's secure against all adversaries, including governmental adversaries, and then the state comes and asks you to update your software so that it's liable for man-in-the-middle attacks or can be in some other way adversarially accessed. If immediately on doing that, all of your core customers discover the fact that you've done it and cease to be your customers, and your business shuts down, then you have kind of insulated your most desperate self from that possible outcome. You take your strongest self, the self that's you in the moment where you are not desperate, and you take this measure that you can't take back. There's a term in economics for it. It's called a Ulysses bargain or a Ulysses pact. Ulysses, when he sailed into the siren-infested waters, he tied himself to the mast of his ship so that when the sirens began singing, he couldn't jump into the sea and drown. We take these irrevocable measures in the moments of strength to guard against moments of weakness. If you're going on a diet, the first thing you should do is throw away your Oreos, not because later on you'll be weak-willed, but because if you're a grown-up, then you understand that your willpower ebbs and flows with your stress level and your blood sugar level and your circumstances, and so you should take advantage in your strong moments of your strength so that in your weak moments you won't compromise yourself. And so, there are a lot of measures that we can take like this, like binary transparency, where every time you ship a binary update to one of your installs in the field, it automatically takes a hash of that update and posts it to a third-party service and with a signature, so that if one person gets a binary that's different to everybody else's binary, it immediately becomes apparent, and there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. What's interesting about that is it starts to change the calculus of your adversary, because the NSA or the Chinese secret police or whoever it is that's trying to inveigle you into putting a backdoor into your product, they're betting that you would rather take the short-term benefit of being able to keep your doors open as against the long-term cost of possibly having it be revealed that you cooperated with them and losing your business. It's like, at the very least, maybe everybody can go on earning dividends and paying their rent for another year or 2 years or 5 years before it all comes out. If that is changed to either you cooperate with the Chinese secret police and get to keep your doors open for a week, or if you do that, within 1 week or 2 weeks, everybody in the world will know you're collaborating with the Chinese secret police, and there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. It may be that the Chinese secret police don't even knock on your door. They may go, oh, well, we are now in a situation where anything we get these people to do will cost them so much that there's no way the board of directors will let them do it. There's no way they will do it. They have already put themselves in this situation. They've got their finger on the trigger of a dead man's switch. Right. And we can't put a gun to their head anymore.
That's really interesting. The matters of open source versus commercial code. Does security matter as a measurement, or are there just much larger issues where when we talk about the security of open source code versus commercial code, does it really not even matter?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of free and open source code that's commercial, right? I mean, Red Hat's not a charitable foundation. So I think it's, when we're talking about security, obviously there are a lot of things that contribute to the security of code, right? There's code audits and the caliber of the engineers who work on it, and red teaming and systems thinking, and even things like making sure that everyone in the chain from source to binary is trusted and trustworthy and also is checked by someone else. All of those things contribute to the security of code. And we could broadly talk about those things as making a system that works well, right? And making a system that works well is super important. Obviously, things that don't work well are not things you want to use. But the big difference, to my mind, between free and open source software and proprietary software is how it fails. I think that open source software fails more gracefully, first because there are fewer hurdles to disclosure more generally. Like, it's unlikely with free and open source software that a disclosure could run up against a trade secret or against a patent dispute or some other thing that might cause your general counsel to prevent you from disclosing what you've learned. Open source and free software is generally antithetical to DRM, which, as we were talking about before, has these huge impediments to disclosure, potential felony prosecutions for disclosure. Making software that's adversarial to its user in open and free software is really hard, because if the software is something that your adversary can compile herself, and somewhere in it is a bit that you toggle to turn the DRM off, then she'll just turn that bit off and then recompile it, and then your stuff doesn't work. It's, by definition, code that's adversarial to a user can't be freely reconfigurable by that user. And so it has a more graceful failure mode. And again, we learned with OpenSSL that merely being open doesn't guarantee that you'll be scrutinized. But again, nobody has ever argued that if OpenSSL were closed, it would be easier to find all the vulnerabilities lurking in it. There's this great quote from an old Woody Guthrie song where he's talking about Joe Louis, the boxer, who had been a civil rights advocate, but who joined the army to fight the fascists. And Woody Guthrie says, when they asked Joe Louis why he was signing up to fight the fascists in Europe, even though he had this long-running dispute with the American government, his answer was, well, there's plenty of things wrong in this world, but Hitler's not helping. Yeah. Right? And there are plenty of things that are hard, that make security hard, but not being able to see the source code doesn't help.
Yeah. No, in kind of along those same lines, it's interesting. You talked about choosing to buy something from a company based on a number of different factors, security being one of them, and how that may not be the wise choice. And I see that it's interesting, another parallel to the cigar industry. A lot of people will say, well, you shouldn't go buy Cuban cigars because you're supporting a fascist government, right? And you should make your buying choices based on, the country of origin and the choices that they make. But you had some interesting takes on this question. I think it relates to security, because a lot of us would say, well, maybe you shouldn't buy that product because they have poor security.
The quest for simple,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the quest for simple answers to complex questions doesn't take us in good directions usually.
Well, so I do think that one of the ways that you can express your moral and technical expertise in the marketplace is by what you buy and what you don't buy. But I think that's where it starts, not where it ends. And the problem with, don't buy it from them, is that it's often a way of saying, shut up and stop complaining about their products. Your only choice as a quote-unquote consumer should be to consume or not to consume. You are an ambulatory wallet, and your role in the marketplace is to dole or not dole dollars out based on offerings being made. I think that's really inadequate, and I think it sells both market orthodoxy short and also human agency short. So, complaining about stuff is one of the ways that stuff gets better. Not least because, even if the company that made the thing that you're complaining about doesn't care and doesn't listen to you, its competitors might. Competitors might say, oh, look at this arrogant giant who's pretending that it doesn't matter that everybody hates that they sweeten their product with high fructose corn syrup, or that they have closed source software, or that they, have a little personal agent shaped like a paperclip that pops up every time you try to write a letter, right? Their competitors might observe that there's a market niche to be filled. The company itself might decide to listen to you. And then there's the regulatory realm, because while I'm not in favor of bad regulation, I don't think that all regulation is by definition bad. And I'm glad that, for example, that when I buy a steak, I'm relatively certain that it's not going to kill me because of deliberate mishandling by the butcher. Mm-hmm. And so there are regulators, and one of the things that regulators need to regulate is action. So like how we got to net neutrality rules from the FCC, for example, was by lots of people being really upset about their ISPs in vocal public ways. And the ISPs point out another problem, which is that sometimes you don't have a robust market, right? A lot of people get to choose between bad and worse in their ISPs. And so having having complaint is one of the ways that we can remedy situations that can't be remedied by spending choices.
Well, certainly one of the things the security community can do today is complain. We excel at that.
Well, that being said, I actually have a thing that I would like security people to complain about in a structured way.
Yes, please do enlighten us, Cory.
Yeah, so the World Wide Web Consortium, which has historically been one of the great bastions of open standards for the web, if you ever tried to teach yourself HTML, your first search result for, how does this tag work is almost always a W3C page. They have had long-standing principles that were really good for open standards. Like they're the only standards body that requires their members not to use their patents against people who implement the standards that they make. So if you come to the W3C, you sign a non-aggression pact for your patents. So anyone can implement any of the W3C standards without worrying about being sued by one of the W3C's members for patent infringement. But the W3C is in a hard place. Apps are making the web less relevant. The browser vendors themselves have less power because the apps are making them less relevant, and so they're making more concessions and demanding more from the W3C by way of concessions. And after many years of refusing to make DRM standards, in 2013 they decided they would make DRM standards. And at Electronic Frontier Foundation, we argued that they shouldn't do this, that this was just on its face a bad idea, that it was going to screw up the web, that it was based on a nonsense. But they had so much push from the browser vendors and also from Netflix, Disney, and a few other big companies. And they got so much money for doing it because they signed up a whole bunch of new members who were paying them $70,000 a year to be at the table to make DRM. Members like the Recording Industry Association of America and the Motion Picture Association of America. That in the end, they ended up doing the wrong thing. So we then proposed, okay, well, if you're going to make DRM, at the very least, take your patent policy and extend it to DRM. So say that people who come to the W3C are not allowed to use their patents to attack people who implement standards, and also not allowed to use the rights that they get under DRM laws, like the DMCA, to attack people who make browser implementations and people who find security vulnerabilities. And this is a proposal that's had a lot of support. Alex Helderman at the University of Michigan, Bruce Schneier, Ross Anderson, all the leading lights of security really said, yeah, by all means, anything you can do to reduce the attack surface on security researchers who discover vulnerabilities in browsers that are intended to replace apps, right? Like the reason they're making HTML5 is to obviate the need for apps to do the rich interactivity we need to control like pacemakers and cars and HVAC systems. And so if those systems are going to be increasingly tethered to browsers, and those browsers are going to be increasingly off limits to security researchers, well, that's really dire. So we proposed this, and what we said was that the group doing this standard shouldn't have its charter renewed unless it agrees to protect security researchers and new entrants this way. And enough members joined us in this proposal that they couldn't renew the charter. And that was in December, so there was a 90-day discussion to see if we could find consensus. And we made progress, but we didn't reach consensus. And at the end of the 90 days, Tim Berners-Lee and the executive of the W3C said, fine, we're just going to renew their charter till September. You guys can't sort it out, so you can just go ahead with no protections for security researchers, which I think was really the wrong decision to make. And so if you're a security researcher, a privacy expert, someone who works either academically or in industry or freelance, please send me an email, cory@EFF.org, CORY@EFF.org. We have an open sign-on letter that's been signed on to by some of the great security researchers of our day, asking the W3C to reconsider this decision. And the first candidate recommendation for W3C DRM just came out this week. So it's really becoming very time sensitive. We're right at the edge of our ability to make a difference here. So if you're hearing this and you really think that security researchers should be able to tell true facts about browsers that literally hundreds of millions of people use for finance, for controlling embedded systems that actuate and sense the real world, that they entrust with their most private and personal communications, please send me an email and let's get the W3C to make the right decision here and to continue its long and very honorable tradition of protecting the open web and its users instead of giving in to industry pressure to, get this short-term benefit.
Absolutely. You heard it. Cory,
great call to action.
.org.
I want to turn over to the rest of the cast and crew. Yeah, Jack.
We've touched on stuff. There are a whole bunch of things. We could have Cory on again. I think there are more.
This was just
more
the first
topics,
interview, Cory.
I have a hunch that a lot of our listeners, and I know some of the other panelists, would like to maybe talk a little bit about his writing. And it's when most of you know this, but Cory talks about DRM and. He's got a stake in it. He's a published author, and right. So obviously, Cory's opposed to making money for his. No, he's not. He's
I was going to say, Cory, your books are freely downloadable still to this day, correct?
Yeah, they're Creative Commons licensed, but they're published by the largest publishers in the world. They're all behind me there. And Tor Books, HarperCollins, Random House. They're New York Times bestsellers. I get six-figure advances for them. They sell very well. So far so good. And I have a stake in this. I on the one hand want to be an artist. It's the thing that I wanted to do all my life. It's amazing every day to wake up and, make up pretend people that help entertain you on your long slog from the cradle to the grave. And on the other hand, it's really horrifying to me that in my name, in the name of protecting creatives, we're inserting systems of control and surveillance into the web. I mean, just look at another part of the DMCA we haven't talked about, DMCA takedown, where anyone can point at anything on the web and say, I allege that infringes my copyright, and it just disappears. No judge, no jury, no evidence, no
just
real penalties for abuse.
It doesn't even take somebody pointing at things anymore. There's so many automated tools that the assumption is that if a TV show pirates a meme that somebody else created, your original work's going to be taken down until and unless you can win an appeal on them infringing on your rights, and it's
been there.
Yeah, I had my novel Homeland taken down by Fox because they have a TV show called Homeland, and their enforcer bot found it and decided that it was infringing because apparently 100K text files are similar to giant MPEG blobs. And that's the standard of care in what amounts to a system of arbitrary and penalty-free censorship.
Yep. So, Cory, I will admit that, of what little I have read of yours, I'm a huge fan, and I know Carlos wants to chime in here. But I find myself having less and less time to actually sit down with dead tree editions of a book or an electronic version on an e-reader or something of the like. So I spend a lot of time doing audiobooks. And I've noted that a lot of your stuff doesn't get put in audiobook format. Can you discuss a little bit?
Actually, let me correct you.
Oh.
I think everything I have is now in audiobooks. The one thing it is not on Audible.
Which is, of course, where I went to my first choice to go download this stuff and fail.
Boy, I would love to have. I reckon I've probably lost something like $70,000 to $100,000 a year for a decade by choosing not to put my books on Audible. And the reason I do that is because they insist that you use their DRM.
Yep, exactly.
They have no DRM-free option. And if you're a big Audible customer, please ask them to allow authors the choice. I'm not saying they should go DRM-free. I'm saying that if the DRM is there to protect me, the copyright holder, then I should have the say about whether or not there's DRM on it.
Fair enough.
And so all my books are available on Downpour, which was started by Blackstone Audio. They have almost the identical catalog to Audible. The only difference is the Audible exclusives, where Audible themselves have produced it. Those tend to be pretty low quality. The books are very good, but they use really amateur readers and really bad production setups to produce them. They're done very cheaply. But all of the major publishers' catalog is available on downpour.com. I also use something called audiobookstore.com, which I think also has all my books. They're also available in the iTunes store as spoken word MP3s, which is sneak them in. Because iTunes won't carry any audiobooks except Audible audiobooks, but there's this loophole, which is that you can sneak them in as spoken word.
Excellent. So now I have a bunch of new books that I'm going to be...
There you go. Carlos, did you have questions for Cory?
No. Really, I think he has covered everything that I was interested in. I have to say I'm a big fan of all of his books. I highly recommend the Marcus Jallow series, which is Little Brother, Homeland, Lawful Intercept, and I think I'm missing one.
No, but I'm writing a new one. I'm writing an adult novel set in that same world called Crypto Wars.
Nice.
And very, very interesting now that you've written a couple in that series, and now those that have gone along and read them as, quote, young adult, and now moving into the adult space. So that's awesome.
Yeah, there's something super science fictional. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, talking about DRM, I highly recommend Pirate Cinema, which is also a very good book from you, the novel, and it's centered around DRM and copyright, and how it's abused in the future.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. I was going to say that there's something science fictional going on with Little Brother, which is that they appear to create these weird time vortexes, because I meet these grown-ass adults who are like, I read your book in the 5th grade, and now I'm the CSO of this startup. And it's like, unless you are a very old-looking 16-year-old, I can't figure out how you could have read this in the 5th grade. But as it turns out, it has been a really long time since I wrote that book. Doesn't feel like that.
And Cory, that was the first book of yours, I think, that I read, and I think I read it when I found that it was available when you announced it on Boing Boing. And at the time, I was into the whole Xbox modding scene and that type of stuff, and reading about leveraging that to build alternate networks, and not to give all of it away for those who haven't read it, because I know everybody who hasn't is going to. How do you stay up on some of the technology and the quote futurism part of some of the things that you write about?
I think that it's not that hard to be futuristic in the 21st century. It's kind of, all you have to do is kind of predict the present. You take things that nerds are paying attention to and normal humans aren't, and just pretend that they've become something that normal humans do too. And that's a pretty straightforward way to kind of project.
That's pretty much science fiction in a nutshell.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And a lot of the times it's just about taking things that are because our news cycle is so short. And everything follows that Gartner hype cycle of there's this huge burst of enthusiasm, and then the trough of despair, and then the long land of just usefulness. And so you can talk about things that everyone stopped talking about, as though they have finished going through the trough of despair and moved off into general utility stuff, and it will feel super prescient, because in a few years that's where we'll get to.
Right.
One political example of this was in 2005, this AT&T technician named Mark Klein, who just retired, walked into EFF's offices, which were then on Shotwell Street in the Mission in San Francisco, and he had a big sheaf of papers, and he said, I've just retired from AT&T. My job there for the last few years was building a secret room at the Folsom Street Switching Center, putting a beam splitter in our fiber trunk, and giving the NSA access to the nation's internet, and without a warrant. And I feel terrible about this, and here you go. And it was on the front page of every newspaper, and it was huge news, and EFF started suing the government. We actually still have a lawsuit from that disclosure underway, because the government has delayed it so much over the years. And although it played so big, people just forgot about it. And so when my book came out, which was when Little Brother came out, which kind of references that kind of surveillance, in 2008, it was around the time WikiLeaks started making a name for itself. And people assumed that I had predicted WikiLeaks. And really what had happened was that Mark Klein had inspired both me and WikiLeaks. And so both come into existence. And then the same thing happened. I wrote Homeland, which is really kind of takes what WikiLeaks did and projects it forward. And it came out around the time Ed Snowden came out of the cold. Snowden actually brought a copy of it with him to Hong Kong and to Russia.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he and I think that people were like, how did you predict that Ed Snowden would dump all of these interesting leaks? And I hadn't. I predicted Cablegate, which had happened 6 months before I started writing the book. It's the easiest kind of prediction to make. Things that have
already happened.
And
the thing is that even though you wrote those books a while ago, they're still very relevant, especially right now that we're going through an election and we're seeing a lot of the dirty tricks and everything that is happening. And we're talking about mobile security and securing your phones and how many of the private contractors out there that are being used by the government and how they are also used in the private sector. All of it's still relevant in the Homeland novel. If you read through it, it is still contemporary to this day.
Sure. I mean, it's not like after Cablegate, the U.S. started procuring its military and surveillance technology from super ethical, above board, fantastic entities, right? I mean, that was only that dumpster fire was only going to get hotter. And, indeed it did. One of the things that happened after WikiLeaks, we saw from other WikiLeaks disclosures later, when people leaked more stuff to WikiLeaks, was that immediately in the wake of WikiLeaks, dirty contractors got even more money to build more things for politicians who were freaked out about WikiLeaks.
Cory, it's been a fantastic conversation. I just have 5 quick questions to ask you to conclude the interview. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
3 words to describe yourself.
Cory Ephraim Doctorow.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Rhetoric.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be? Confessions of a would-be cypherpunk. In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I allow the other person to go first, or to choose first, because then I get some game theoretical advantage I'm having a hard time articulating.
Like home field, you get home field advantage. I gotcha.
Yeah, that's it.
Home field advantage?
Home field, yes, home field advantage. Cory, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Okay. Galacticus and Jessica Rabbit.
Wow. That's awesome. That's the first Jessica Rabbit answer.
That's also the first Galacticus answer we've ever had. So.
Cory, thank you so much for appearing on the Security Weekly show. We're looking forward to having you come back. Of course, Cory's website is craphound.com. Thank you very much again, Cory. It was wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you.
Oh, and we're going to take a short break, come back, and we're going to talk about the Pwn Pad from Pony Express, so stay tuned. Yay.